So the Labour Party will support this Psychoactive Substances Amendment Bill. The two principal objectives of this bill are policies that Labour wholeheartedly endorses and supports. The first is to remove the transition provisions of the Principal Act that have allowed for untested drugs to remain on the shelf and available for sale to the public. That is a position that, like other parties in the House, Labour came to in response to the overwhelming public outcry that untested drugs remained available and that their effects were unknown and that their effects only became apparent when young people and other people using those drugs experienced the harmful side effects of those substances. And that situation really flew in the face of the principles behind the original legislation, which were that psychoactive substances would need to be tested first before they could go on the market for sale, that the onus of proof that they were of low or no risk would lay with the manufacturers, not with the users and the community around them. The other objective of this legislation is to ban all animal testing for psychoactive substances. This is a policy that Labour has supported since the principal legislation was debated in the House. And our party, along with other parties, supported the amendment in the name of Mojo Mathers to remove animal testing right back when we were debating the principal legislation. That amendment was blocked by the National Party, by the United Future Party, actually I think it was Peter Dunn, Independent MP at the time, and through the abstention of the New Zealand First Party. So we could have dealt with this issue of animal testing long before today, but we're very, very happy that it has been included in this legislation again, because the government has finally buckled to public pressure and the overwhelming pressure that's been placed upon it by opposition parties. Sir, it's never a positive outcome when a piece of legislation is having to be amended such a short space of time after it was originally passed. The Psychoactive Substances Act was passed in July last year. It received its first reading in April last year, a little over 12 months ago. And at the time, after the first reading debate, there was a debate in the House around the shortened select committee period that Parliament was being given to consider the legislation. And at that time, in that debate, I said that I was concerned that we were rushing this legislation, that it was complex legislation, that it was novel, that no other country in the world had attempted this approach to regulating psychoactive substances, and that it was absolutely inappropriate for Parliament to be rushing the legislation. And I warned that mistakes would be made. In fact, I went back and checked out exactly what it was I said, and I said, I don't want us to be back here in 12 months' time realising that we've made a mistake and having to fix those mistakes up. Here we are. I'm afraid, apologies if it's not the exact quote. Here we are, 12 months later, admitting that we made a mistake. Now, Paul Hutchison makes a very important point. 119 MPs supported this bill. I supported this bill. I sat on the Select Committee and considered the issues. One of the issues was, should we have a transition period? The Select Committee decided that we should. That decision was made at breakneck speed because we were given just 2 months at Select Committee to deal with these complex issues, the first country in the world dealing with this type of legislation, and the government gave us 1/3 of the time that it would normally give a Select Committee to consider those issues. Now, the government will say, quite rightly, that we needed to have the legislation passed by Mike Sabin. Just be quiet and let me say what I have to say. The legislation had to be passed by August last year, but because the government failed to prioritise the Psychoactive Substances Act, the legislation was only brought to the House in February last year. Now, if we got started in February last year, that would have given us a little bit of time. But what the government did was it sat on that legislation from February until April and gave the Select Committee even less time to consider the legislation. What the Members' Party did until 2008 is we asked the Law Commission to do a complete review of the Misuse of Drugs Act because we understood that the Misuse of Drugs Act was no longer capable of dealing with the number and variety of drugs that were available for supply in the 21st century. That's what the Labor government did. We asked the Independent Law Commission to go away and figure out what the best way forward was. The Law Commission came back in April 2011 with a comprehensive report, one chapter of which is the precursor to the Psychoactive Substances Act. Just one chapter. It took that government 2 years to take the recommendations from the Law Commission on psychoactive substances, 2 years to bring that legislation before the House, and then it said to Parliament, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to rush this. And that's why mistakes were made, because that government didn't prioritise getting these drugs off the street. That's why Parliament made a mistake. I'm happy to say I was one of the MPs who voted for that legislation, and it was the right thing to do, because had we not passed that legislation, then all those drugs would still be out there. Not 41, about 300 different drugs would still be out there if we hadn't passed the legislation. But it wasn't perfect, and one of the main reasons it wasn't perfect is because the Select Committee was not given time to consider it properly, and the Select Committee didn't have time because that government did not make this a priority. That's the fact. The other reason we're back here today is, having implemented the legislation, the government then made an absolute dog's breakfast of resourcing it, giving the Ministry of Health the tools it needed, and getting the regulations sorted out. And one of the reasons we hear for why it's taken so long to get the regulations sorted out is that John Key was uncomfortable with animal testing. But it was the National Party that blocked the amendments that would have stopped animal testing. So if we'd gone back and got the legislation right in the first place, if the National Party had voted for Mojo Mather's amendment, then we wouldn't have had to delay the regulation-making process, because John Key wouldn't have had to worry about animal testing. But the other thing the government has failed to do is use the provisions in the current legislation to get rid of unsafe drugs. It got rid of 5 at the beginning of the year. Well done, not bad. But then after the announcement that the law was going to be changed, it got rid of another 6. That just smacks of an under-resourced Ministry of Health, incapable of properly implementing the original legislation. This has been a shambles from the National Government from the very beginning. Their failure to respond to the Law Commission report, their slow response when one was finally coming, the rushed Select Committee process that caused mistakes in the legislation, and then the shambolic implementation of the legislation once it was finally passed. Make no mistake, New Zealand, the reason why we've got untested, unsafe drugs still on our streets is because the National Party has made a hash of this from day one. And the reason for that is they never prioritised this issue. It was never important to them. It's always been a rush job. Here's another rush job, and it is simply a reflection of the fact that making sure our young people are safe from drugs that have a high risk of causing harm was never a priority for this government, and that's why we're in the mess we're in today, and that's why we're having to clean it up.
Dr. Paul Hutchinson.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Ian Lees-Galloway